feminism, bourgeois ideology. And the first part I would say is that it's necessary to recognize that feminism is not a monolith. And the key thing to bear in mind is that the origins of feminism in the West are, of course, much more, well, they are rooted in the Enlightenment tradition, because the first recognized feminist thinker who came out of the Enlightenment period is, of course, Mary Wollstonecraft, and she wrote the Vindication of the Rights of Woman in the immediate period after the French Revolution in the 1790s. But it should be emphasized that before that, she also wrote another work called A Vindication of the Rights of Men. And this was a direct response to Edmund Burke. And this is a work that frequently gets overlooked because Tom Paine's book, On the Rights of Man, is the one that hogs all the plaudits with regard to titles of that description. But I would encourage anybody to read Vindication of the Rights of Woman, certainly. It's a very important work. It's the foundational text of modern day feminism. And of course, you should read Vindication of the Rights of Men alongside that as well, because she has other things to say in there about women. And there's a couple of quotes which I think are worth just emphasizing with regard to this early work by Wollstonecraft. And because first of all, they're incredibly well written, and second of all, it reveals her to be one of those Enlightenment thinkers whose ideas, as it turns out, could never be fully realized under capitalism. So in the rights in men, or Vindication of the Rights of Men, she does write something which I think is very telling, and it's in direct response to Edmund Burke. And she is very cutting and sarcastic, and has a lot of very witty put-downs towards Edmund Burke, who she plainly loathed, and with good justification as well. Like, Burke's politics are loathsome, and he's incredibly intellectually dishonest. He's a great writer, but a very dishonest one, for reasons I went into ages ago on a podcast where we examined Burke and Paine. But I wanted to give you this quote because I think it's brilliant, and reads as follows. "You may have convinced women that littleness and weakness are the very essence of beauty, and that the Supreme Being, in giving women beauty in the most supereminent degree, seems to command them by the powerful voice of nature not to cultivate the moral virtues that might chance to excite respect and interfere with the pleasing sensations they were created to inspire, thus confining truth, fortitude, and humanity within the rigid pace of manly morals. They might justly argue that to be loved, woman's high end and great distinction, they should learn to lisp, to totter in their walk, and nickname God's creatures. Never, they might repeat after you, was any man, much less a woman, rendered amiable by the force of those exalted qualities, fortitude, justice, wisdom, and truth, and thus forewarned of the sacrifice they must make to those austere and natural virtues, they would be authorized to turn all their attention to their persons, systematically neglecting morals to secure beauty." Which is a brilliant piece of writing, and of course one that is, as I said, still under discussion, still relevant, because what she's talking about there, when she's talking about the way in which women are presented, and she's making a direct response to Burke there, in the way that Burke has used femininity to imply weakness and to imply lack of wisdom. So she's making a reply there about, well, what being a woman actually is, which I think is a brilliant passage, because she brings out something which I think is relevant for the discussion here, which is she's saying that, well, why is it that you, Burke, have placed these ridiculous values on what being a woman is, which I'll repeat that Burke, this is what she's accusing Burke of saying, that women should learn to lisp, to totter in their walk, and nickname God's creatures. And if we look at the first two things of parts of that passage, you can certainly see that this is something which is still a controversy at the moment, because I would argue that over the last really 30 years, it's the case that the emancipation of women has basically run into a wall. It's run into a wall because of the generalized collapse of the working class movement, the generalized collapse of socialism. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But I wanted to give you that excerpt as an example of what a great writer Wollstonecraft is and what a great read her works are. So Wollstonecraft writes a Vindication of the Rights of Woman to reply, which it's dedicated to the French minister Talleyrand, but apparently one of the other inspirations for it was the massive and very well documented misogyny of Mr. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a guy who had a long list of issues with women that would probably keep a Freudian psychoanalyst employed for about 100 years to try to unravel. But the basic thing to take away from it is that Wollstonecraft is making a very sound point, which is that in all the Enlightenment theory that was very brilliant at the time, it of course neglected entirely women, but it also of course entirely neglected anybody who wasn't a bourgeois. And this of course goes back to the earliest examples of the bourgeois revolutions, which is of course in England. And there, even the most radical section of the New Model Army, the Levellers, they were calling for universal manhood suffrage, not universal suffrage. They weren't including women in that. And it remained the case that women weren't included in the campaigns for universal suffrage at all, even when it radicalized further with the emergence of mass working class movements demanding the vote for men. And this is the case with the movement that met its bloody end just up the road from where I'm speaking to you from now, which is in St. Peter's Field in Manchester, where there was a massacre in 1819 of men and women who were demanding universal manhood suffrage. Women's demands were not included then. And it takes all the way through the 19th century and into the 20th, for of course in the British case, for universal suffrage to become a real demand, with the beginnings of the suffragette movement and that rising to prominence in the way that it did. Point I'm making about all of this is that yes, feminism begins with Wollstonecraft and then others to follow her as part of the Enlightenment tradition, but also as a response to the already present failures in the Enlightenment tradition. Because of course, as Marx and others pointed out, the Enlightenment philosophers were very brilliant minds and wrote a lot of very inspiring philosophy and political manifestos. But ultimately, this was very reflective of its origins, which was it was an Enlightenment that was based on the bourgeois, that excluded all women, that excluded, of course, the entire working class. And if you look at the foundational documents of America, these brilliant examples of liberalism, they, of course, excluded not only that, but, of course, the slaves and the native population. So as soon as it emerges, as we've said frequently before, bourgeois ideology meaning principally liberalism, is something which emerges, which, even though it has to make mass appeals in order to win over the masses to join its armies, to join the fight against feudalism, or in the case of America, against the British, it, of course, has no intention of delivering upon the universal rights that it talks about to the wider layers of the population. It has only intentions of delivering these in a partial way to a small segment, the property-owning classes. And of course, women are excluded from that. This is examined further by Engels in Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State. And of course, there is then a tradition that flows into the 20th century of various women thinkers in the socialist movement and the communist movement adapting and adopting or trying to adapt feminism into their thought. The There was a number of Bolsheviks who were, of course, Bolshevik women who were leaders in the October Revolution. Many more who played important roles in places like Ukraine and Belarus, Baltic states, and others who are still remembered in various places in Russia by the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which has lost to our histories now. I may go into some of those lesser-known figures in the Russian Revolution in the future. My point is there's figures like Kollontai, Zetkin, and others, and those are incredibly important Marxist thinkers who grappled with the question of the exploitation of women. Because as Engels identifies, and as Marx identified as well, there is, of course, a double oppression facing proletarian women, because they were not just exploited if they did work, and a lot of them did. A lot of the early mills in this part of the world were staffed by child labor and female labor, which of course was paid less than the men. And of course they are frequently trapped in marriages that were, shall we say, not only loveless but often horrific and brutal, which is why the demands for female emancipation in the 19th and the 20th century focused on things like the need to legalize abortion, the need to secure divorce rights, and the need for women to enter the workforce on equal terms as far as possible to men. But of course, this all, even though it was achieved and it achieves positive results, is something which is still partial, it's still inadequate. Now, why is that when it comes to the position of women? It is because, of course, the contradictions of capitalism force women into a disadvantageous position. And the question is, well, can feminism as a political expression solve this? And my answer would be no. Because even though, of course, we must defend bourgeois democratic reforms that improve the position of women, the position of racial minorities, the position of workers themselves who benefit from bourgeois democratic reforms. It is always the case, as Marx pointed out when it comes to things like the 8-hour day, that these are only partial. The capitalists, when it comes to reforms over wages or working hours, will seek to circumvent them however they can. But it doesn't mean they're pointless. There's an argument going on in what I would call the overly memed world at the moment, the extremely online, largely American, I'm sad to say, but British people are guilty of this as well, leftism or pseudo-communism or MAGA communism, which is all MAGA and no communism, that, they've adopted what I would call ultra-reactionary points of view, arguing that, feminism is divisive. Feminism divides the working class. It divides men from women. No, it doesn't. Feminism doesn't do that. Capitalism does. The oppression of women does. The commodification of women and sexuality does that. The hyper-prevalence of pornography does that. And so this leads us to the question then, which is, well, what about this point that these extremely online weirdos make, which is, we should just get rid of feminism and focus on class? Well, let's examine that claim. Can we just focus on class without acknowledging that within half of the working class, the female end of the working class, that they, as women, face even more potential problems under capitalism and exploitation and brutal consequences of the system and its ideology than men do? And this is certainly true because women workers will more likely be the ones who are left caring for children when it's far more frequently, in fact, than it is the other way around, that the man clears off and leaves the woman literally holding the baby. It is far more common that women will be the targets of extremely violent crimes, often of a sexual nature. It is far more common that women will be left in the situation where they're working for poverty wages than men. And that's true in the advanced capitalist nations now. And it's true that since the giant setbacks of the 1980s and early 1990s, that the position of women workers has not improved substantially, I would argue, even though there's been breakthroughs here and there. And then, therefore, the question is, well, what is the way forward? Is it possible that the radical separatist feminists are right, that women should all take themselves off to a commune somewhere and allow men in on a carefully selected basis, or if at all? Well, I would argue no, that doesn't take us anywhere. So what should communists adopt in terms of our attitude towards this? How should we examine this question? Well, we have to acknowledge that as I've just been saying, the position of women workers in capitalist society is still objectively a worse situation in many respects than male workers. They are, as I've already said, subject to more violent crimes, subject to even more hyper-exploitation. They are often, of course, the overwhelming victims of the so-called sex industry and the horrific consequences of pornography. So a communist party needs to be building all of that into its program and its analysis. And so what we need to be doing is looking at the feminist tradition and examining what parts of it need to be, to use Hegel's term, sublated into a communist politics. Because the class reductionists say, got to focus on class. Well, okay, well, part of the class question is the position of the female part of the class. And if the female part of the class is still can't be fully emancipated under capitalism and suffers from more structural barriers, then what do we do about that? Do we just ignore it? Well, we can't just ignore it, because if we're going to have a party worthy of the name, then it needs to be fully representative of the working class, which means it's got to be 50-50 in any situation. It's got to be aiming really to be 50-50 men and women inside of it, and 50-50 all the way up to the leadership positions, because that makes it truly reflective of the class and the masses as a whole. So the political program that we must build must speak to the fact that women still suffer these structural disadvantages and are often more exploited than men, and this needs to be built into our program. And it also needs to be built into the way in which we educate the cadre of communist parties. There's been far too many cases, not just in communist parties and so-called socialist parties, but in the trade unions as well, where, I mean, in British terms, GMB is the one that sticks in recent mind for doing this. They'll have all these workshops on women in the workplace, and you'll get all these leaders saying, oh yeah, feminism, love all that. And then they'll all get caught in a sex scandal or a sexual harassment scandal and all have to resign. So it's become, in trade union terms, just a box-ticking exercise, like everything else, to be honest. And it's become, for far too many socialist organizations that I've been a member of, they're not 50-50 men and women by any means, nor do they seek to overcome the structural the disadvantages that women face in getting active in these organizations. They've all become basically boys' clubs, drinking societies. And I'll give the example of when I was in the Socialist Party. There were 25 regularly active members in the Manchester branch at its height, of which 20 were men and 5 were women, only 3 of which were regularly active. And so the discussions would always, and the discussions, by the way, would always be the same men speaking over and over again. And we never tackled that, to be blunt. And part of that failure is my responsibility as well. So we never tackled it because fundamentally the priority for the party was just getting the numbers down. And if that meant 20 men out of 25 and only 3 women active for a branch covering a city the size of Manchester, then so be it. And again, it was reflected on all the trade union bodies I've been a part of. It overwhelmingly consist of men. Overwhelmingly consisted of like older men as well. That's a reflection of the fact that women in the union movement, their position, I think, in many unions had gone backwards since the 80s and 90s. So clearly there's an issue there to be overcome. And I think we overcome that by examining all the critiques that feminists in the 20th century have had and seeing which of those can actually be built into our political praxis, shall we say. And we have to do that because we have to acknowledge that many of the critiques that the feminists have raised about certainly the effects of pornography, the sex industry, and all the other things that come as part of the rotten package of modern capitalism, all do have an impact on our movement. And the assumptions which a lot of men carry into the movement regarding women can be, and in fact are often, very damaging. So we really need to educate the cadre of our communist organizations on this, need to consciously identify where the, shall we say, misogynistic assumptions might be creeping in, examine the damaging nature of bourgeois ideology that both men, particularly men, but also women, bring into organizations. How can we overcome that with political education? How can our organization be made in such a way as to promote this 50-50 balance that should exist? And let's just say that, if Mao is right, and he mostly is, and women hold up half the sky, which is poetic and true, then women should be half our organizations all the way up and down. And so that's got to be our aim. We've got to examine the fact that feminism, through Wollstonecraft and others, might have been born as part of the Enlightenment tradition. Its aims as a movement, or if it can even be called a movement, I think there's many different parts of feminism, but can its aims be achieved under capitalism? Absolutely not. And it certainly can't be achieved by, like, Hillary Clinton modern liberal feminism of having more, the old meme, which is more female drone pilots or more female CIA directors, or Kamala Harris in the White House, because that's not going to achieve anything for anybody other than the bourgeoisie. So true liberation, I think, for women can only come through communism. And if you look at the history of socialist countries in the 20th century, even though, of course, I wouldn't claim that any of these were perfect when it came to the condition of women, they certainly made a hell of a lot of advances. If you look at the way that the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, was structured, it certainly promoted the active involvement of women in the political system on a far higher level than occupied West Germany did. And up to the end, there was more and more women at the national level, and at every level of government, more and more were getting involved. It was still tilted towards men at the highest level, but I think I'm right in saying in the book Stasi State or Socialist Paradise, that I would recommend everybody read about the GDR. I think at the lower levels, it was at least 50-50, if not slightly tilted towards women. So if the GDR survived, which it should have done, they would have continued those improvements. You get the position of women in the Soviet Union, of course, which goes through certain changes. But even with the mistakes that were made in the 30s, such as banning abortion, the position of women overwhelmingly improved in terms of their entry into the workforce, their entry into the proletariat en masse in a way that, of course, they were denied under the Tsardom. And, of course, these massively increased opportunities for education. So the position of women in the socialist countries of Eastern Europe and the old Soviet Union was something that improved enormously. Same is true in revolutionary China and, of course, Vietnam, the DPRK, all of which sought to improve the position of women. And if you look at what could have happened had the PDPA won in Afghanistan compared to the barbarism that followed, well, you don't need to make much more of an argument about the superiority of socialism. But I think that the question over the damaging bourgeois ideology that we all carry into the movement with us does need to be addressed. It does need to be interrogated. I mean, if you look at look back at that quote from Wollstonecraft about the cliched way that Burke viewed women, and you can see that cliched way that women are viewed, like tottering on their heels and lisping at the men, well, that's still out there. I mean, that's now held up as like an aspirational for women in modern bourgeois culture. And so we as communists have got to be against all of that. And that involves, of course, taking a firm, very firm line on being against pornography, being against prostitution, being against all the damaging effects of the pornographication of modern culture. So it's not just like open pornography, it's the fact that porn basically like has become an aesthetic in movies and culture and everything else. So all of this is what we've got to tackle. And if you look at something as ridiculous as gender ideology and the idea that men can become women or that women can become men, but let's focus on the men's rights elements of this, which is that men can become women. Now, I've known a couple of guys, both fucking crazy as a bag of spanners, who've decided suddenly that they're women. What did they do? They transformed themselves into, or tried to, into exactly what Wollstonecraft is denouncing in that work from 1790, which is tottering on heels and lisping at the men. That's what they did to themselves. For reasons I can't understand, but they were crazy, so that's what they were doing. And so it shows we're not able to move beyond those cliches of what being a woman is. Women aren't able to fully become equal parts of society under capitalism. So only communism can do that, and we can only do that if we sort out the politics and culture in our organizations to the point where we can actually have that 50-50 balance, where we model in our organizations, as far as we possibly can, the kind of relationships between men and women that should exist under socialism in a workers' state. And those started to exist in places like the DDR, in the old Soviet Union, where, of course, there was that comprehensive system of childcare that was so overwhelmingly popular, and women were able to integrate relatively easily back into the workforce. They weren't obliged to spend ages at home caring for the child. They could if they wanted to, or they could leave their children with people who they knew and trusted in the childcare centres so they could go back to work or go back to education. And of course, they were able to easily, or more easily, end a marriage that wasn't working or where the man had become unbearable. And I would argue it would become far less likely that people would get stuck in marriages that were dead ends, that were abusive towards the woman, that were going nowhere. And also the general attitude of, or the general culture between men and women would improve when we not only change the material conditions, but then also, to follow up on what I was saying in the episode about Stalin's work, Anarchism or Socialism, you then have to conduct a struggle against the lingering elements of bourgeois ideology. And that includes all the bourgeois ideology that certainly men carry with them, carry with us regarding women. And that needs to be something which is part of our struggle. So that's my rather long way of answering Jason's question, which is yes, that feminism emerges both as a part of Enlightenment thought in the era of the bourgeois revolution, but it also emerges in as a criticism to that Enlightenment thought, going further than Wollstonecraft goes further than Tom Paine does, because he's also part of that Enlightenment tradition, but also a critic of it. Wollstonecraft goes further, much further. And to finish on this point, the fact that points she made are still not addressed shows that capitalism cannot address them. So communism must, and we must build our organizations to model the sort of behavior we actually want to see in the future society. It's my rather long way of answering that question, but I hope it satisfies.